7 signs you're carrying shame that was never yours to begin with. The weight you never questioned. You don't remember learning to feel this way about yourself. That's the first thing worth sitting with. Because most of the beliefs we hold about our own worth, our own adequacy, our own fundamental okayness, they didn't arrive through conscious reasoning. They weren't conclusions you reached after careful evaluation of the evidence. They were absorbed, gradually, in environments where you had no framework to question them and no distance to evaluate whether they were actually true. A child doesn't fact-check the emotional atmosphere they grow up in. They don't have the cognitive tools to say, this feeling being directed at me is about the person directing it, not about me. They don't know how to separate the message from the messenger. They just receive, and what gets received early enough and consistently enough becomes indistinguishable from self-knowledge. That's how borrowed shame works. It doesn't arrive with a label. It doesn't announce itself as something external that was placed on you by someone else's unresolved pain. It arrives feeling like insight, like an accurate reading of who you are, like the kind of self-awareness that mature people have when they're honest with themselves about their limitations. And that's precisely what makes it so hard to identify, because it feels like yours. There's a specific kind of shame that points at something you did, a choice, a behavior, an action that contradicted your values. That kind of shame is functional. It's your internal compass telling you that something needs to change. It belongs to you because it's responding to something you actually did. But there's another kind, the kind that doesn't point at what you did, the kind that points at what you are, at something fundamental and fixed about your nature, something that was supposedly always there, always wrong, always slightly too much or never quite enough. This kind of shame doesn't respond to good behavior. It doesn't quiet down when you succeed. It doesn't lift when people tell you that you're doing well, because it was never about your behavior to begin with. Epictetus understood this distinction with a clarity that is still remarkable 2,000 years later. Born into slavery, a condition designed to impose shame as a structural feature of someone's existence, he spent his entire philosophical life making one argument, that there is what is yours and there is what is not yours. And the single most important work a human being can do is learn to tell the difference. That work starts with recognition. And recognition starts with 7 specific signs, not as a checklist, not as a diagnosis, as a mirror. A way of seeing, perhaps for the first time with real clarity, what you've been carrying, and whether it was ever actually yours to carry. Do you apologize for taking up space? There's a version of this that looks like politeness, like consideration for others, like the kind of social awareness that makes someone easy to be around. And on the surface, it is those things. But underneath, for some people, it's something else entirely. It shows up in the small moments. Apologizing before asking a question that's completely reasonable to ask. Shrinking your opinion down to a suggestion, then down to a possibility, then abandoning it entirely before anyone even pushes back. Feeling genuinely guilty for needing something, time, attention, help, space, as though your needs are inherently an imposition on the people around you. Most people who do this don't experience it as self-erasure. They experience it as consideration, as not wanting to be a burden, as being realistic about their place in a room. The internal narrative sounds like humility, but humility is a choice made from a position of security. What we're describing here is a reflex, an automatic pre-conscious adjustment that happens before you've even evaluated whether an apology is actually warranted. The origin of this pattern is almost always environmental. Not a single dramatic event, a sustained atmosphere. Homes where a child's needs were treated as inconvenient, where asking for things created tension, where being too loud, too emotional, too present, too much generated a response, a sigh, a dismissal, a withdrawal of warmth that taught the child over hundreds of repetitions that their presence required justification. The child doesn't conclude, "My caregiver is overwhelmed and handling it poorly." The child concludes, "I am too much." And that conclusion, once made, doesn't stay in childhood. It travels. It shows up in every room you enter as an adult, quietly asking, am I allowed to be here? Am I taking up more than my share? Epictetus wrote in the Discourses that no person is free who is not master of themselves. But there's a prior condition to that mastery that he understood intimately. You cannot govern what you haven't first identified as yours. The habit of apologizing for your existence isn't a character trait. It's a learned response to an environment that no longer exists. And recognizing that distinction is the first step toward no longer letting it govern you. But apologizing for your presence is only the surface. The next sign goes deeper into how you relate to your own perception of yourself. You dismiss compliments before you can feel them. Someone tells you that you did something well, that you handled a situation with intelligence, or showed up for someone with real care, or produced something genuinely impressive. And before the sentence is even finished, before the words have had time to land, something inside you is already working to neutralize them. Maybe you deflect with humor. Maybe you immediately point to everything that was imperfect about what they're praising. Maybe you attribute the outcome to luck, or to circumstance, or to the contributions of everyone else involved. Maybe you simply say thanks in a tone that communicates clearly that you don't believe a word of it. From the outside, this can look like modesty. In certain professional or social contexts, it even gets rewarded as such. But modesty is the conscious choice to not overstate your contributions. What we're describing here is something different. The automatic, almost involuntary rejection of positive information about yourself before it can be integrated. And the reason it has to be rejected quickly is important. Because receiving a compliment, really receiving it, letting it land, allowing it to become part of how you see yourself, requires believing even briefly that it might be accurate. And for someone carrying shame that was installed before they had language to question it, that moment of believing is threatening, not consciously, not in a way you could easily articulate, but the system that learned long ago that you were not quite enough will reject contradicting evidence with remarkable efficiency. This is what Jung described when he wrote about the persona and the shadow, the gap between the self we present and the self we've buried. The compliment threatens to close that gap even slightly, and the part of you that built its entire operating system around the buried self being the true self will resist that closing with everything it has. Think about the last time someone said something genuinely positive about you, not flattery, something specific and earned. What happened in the 3 seconds after they said it? Did you let it in? Or did something move to intercept it before it could reach you? That 3-second window is where borrowed shame operates most visibly. And most people have never stopped to examine what happens there. This next sign is the one most people find hardest to recognize because it looks exactly like a strength. You confuse hypervigilance with emotional intelligence. You've always been good at reading rooms. You notice shifts in energy before anyone else does. You can tell when someone is upset before they've said anything. You pick up on subtle changes in tone, in body language, in the way someone pauses a fraction of a second too long before answering. You've probably been told at various points in your life that you're unusually perceptive, emotionally intelligent, attuned, and you are perceptive. That part is real. But the question worth asking, the one that most people in this position never ask, is, why did you develop this particular skill with such intensity? What were the conditions that made this level of attunement not just useful but necessary? Because there's a meaningful difference between being interested in how other people feel and needing to know how other people feel in order to feel safe yourself. Genuine emotional intelligence is curious. It reaches outward from a place of security, wanting to understand other people's inner experience, because connection and comprehension feel valuable. Hypervigilance is different. It monitors, it scans. It's constantly running a background process that assesses threat levels. Not physical threat, but emotional threat. The threat of someone's displeasure, of the atmosphere in the room shifting in a direction that history has taught you to be afraid of. Children who grow up in unpredictable emotional environments, homes where a parent's mood could change without warning, where warmth was inconsistent, where conflict was frequent or tension was chronic, learn to read the adults around them with extraordinary precision. Not because they're naturally gifted, because the reading is protective. Knowing what's coming gives you time to adjust, to disappear, to become whatever the moment requires in order to avoid the consequences of being caught off guard. That's not a personality trait. That's a survival strategy that outlived the environment that created it. And the cost of that strategy in adult life is significant. Relationships where you're more focused on managing the other person's emotional state than on expressing your own. Professional environments where you're perpetually calibrating your behavior to the mood of the room, instead of acting from your own judgment. A chronic, low-grade exhaustion that comes from never fully being able to turn the monitoring off. The fourth sign is quieter than the others, but in many ways it's the most revealing. Your inner critic sounds like someone else. Everyone has an inner critic, that's not the issue. The issue is what it says, how it says it, and whether the voice doing the talking actually belongs to you. Most people, when they examine their internal self-critical voice with real attention, discover something unsettling. The tone isn't neutral. It isn't the measured, objective feedback of someone who wants you to improve. It's sharper than that, more personal, more absolute. It doesn't say that could have been done better. It says you're not good enough. It doesn't point at the behavior. It points at the person, and it does so with a familiarity and a certainty that suggests it has been saying these things for a very long time. When you slow down enough to actually listen to the specific language your inner critic uses, the words it chooses, the situations that trigger it, the particular ways it diminishes you, a pattern often becomes visible. The voice has a history. It has a tone you've heard before. It emphasizes the things that were emphasized in your environment growing up. It's harsh about the things that were treated as failures in the rooms you grew up in. It's silent about things that were never deemed important there. Jung called this process introjection, the internalization of external figures, particularly authority figures, as psychological content. The parent, the teacher, the older sibling, the coach, their voices don't stay external. They get absorbed. They become part of the internal structure through which you process your own experience. And once absorbed, they stop sounding like someone else's opinion and start sounding like objective truth. Here's something worth trying. The next time your inner critic activates, the next time you hear that voice diminishing something you did or questioning something you are, stop for a moment before you accept what it's saying. Ask one question. Whose standards am I being measured against right now? Not yours. Whose? Because if the answer isn't yours, if the measuring stick being used against you was handed to you by someone else, in a context that no longer exists, by a person who was themselves operating from their own unexamined shame, then the verdict the critic is delivering isn't yours to accept. You can acknowledge the voice without obeying it. You can hear it without letting it function as truth. That distinction between hearing and obeying is one of the most practically useful things Epictetus ever articulated. In the Discourses, he returns repeatedly to the same idea. It is not events that disturb us, but our judgments about events. And a judgment inherited from someone else's pain is still a judgment you are choosing in this moment to endorse. The fifth sign moves from the internal to the behavioral, and it shows up in the people you choose to keep close. You're drawn to relationships that confirm the story. This one is difficult to see clearly from the inside, because the pattern doesn't feel like self-sabotage. It feels like familiarity, like chemistry, like the inexplicable sense that certain people just feel right in a way that others don't, even when, from the outside, the dynamic is clearly costing you something. Borrowed shame doesn't just shape how you see yourself. It shapes who you allow close enough to see you. And more specifically, it shapes the emotional texture of relationships that feel natural versus relationships that feel somehow off, even when the ones that feel off are actually healthier than anything you've known before. Here's the mechanism. When shame gets installed early enough, it doesn't just become a belief, it becomes a relational template, a set of expectations about how interactions work, what you deserve from them, what it means when someone treats you well versus when someone treats you poorly. And because the template was formed in conditions where certain kinds of treatment were normalized, those conditions become the baseline against which everything else gets measured. This means that a relationship where someone is consistently dismissive, critical, or emotionally unavailable can feel deeply familiar, not comfortable, but recognizable in a way that registers as connection. While a relationship where someone is consistently present, affirming, and genuinely interested in who you are can feel vaguely suspicious. Too easy. Like they must be missing something. Like it's only a matter of time before they see what you actually are and adjust accordingly. That waiting, the low-grade anticipation of eventual rejection, even in genuinely good relationships, is borrowed shame operating at the relational level. It isn't protecting you. It's recreating the conditions of the original wound, over and over, in the unconscious hope that this time the outcome will be different. The sixth sign is about achievement, and why for some people no amount of success ever feels like enough. You use achievement to silence the shame instead of resolving it. There's a version of ambition that comes from genuine curiosity and the desire to build something meaningful. And there's a version that comes from something much older and much less peaceful. The need to produce enough external evidence of worth to finally silence the internal voice that says you don't have any. These two versions can look identical from the outside. Same hours worked, same goals pursued, same level of visible commitment. But the internal experience is completely different. One feels like movement towards something, the other feels like running from something. And the difference matters, not just psychologically but practically, because they produce completely different relationships with the results they generate. When achievement is driven by genuine purpose, a success produces satisfaction. It lands, it registers as meaningful. It contributes to a stable, growing sense of what you're capable of and what you're building. You can receive it the same way you can't receive a compliment, because it isn't being used to answer a deeper question about your fundamental worth. But when achievement is being used to silence shame, the success doesn't land the same way. It produces relief, brief, temporary, and immediately followed by the return of the original anxiety. Because the shame wasn't resolved, it was just quieted for a moment. And quieted shame requires increasingly louder achievements to produce the same effect. Seneca wrote in his letters to Lucilius, "Recede into ipse, retire into yourself," not as an instruction to withdraw from the world, but as a confrontation with a specific human pattern, the tendency to keep moving outward, toward achievement, toward recognition, toward external validation, as a way of avoiding the internal reckoning that actually needs to happen. The thing that borrowed shame tells you is that you are not enough as you are, and that achievement is the path to becoming enough. But achievement built on that premise doesn't close the gap. It just keeps you busy enough to avoid noticing that the gap was never real to begin with. And the seventh sign brings everything together, because it shows up not in what you do, but in what you cannot allow yourself to receive. You cannot accept that you might actually be enough. This is the deepest one. And in many ways it contains all the others. It shows up differently in different people. For some, it's a persistent background dissatisfaction, the sense that wherever they are, they should be further along. For others, it's an inability to rest without guilt, as though stillness is something that has to be earned through productivity. For others still, it's a reflexive minimization of everything they've built, every quality they possess, every relationship they've managed to sustain, as though acknowledging these things would be naive or premature, or somehow inviting the universe to correct the record. What all of these share is the same core belief, that the current version of you in this moment, without any additional achievement or improvement or proof of worth, is not quite enough. That there is a threshold, just slightly out of reach, that once crossed will finally make you acceptable to others, to yourself, to whatever internal authority has been keeping score all this time. The problem is that the threshold moves. It always moves. Because the threshold was never real. It was a structural feature of the shame itself. Borrowed shame doesn't have a finish line. It has a horizon. And horizons by design recede as you approach them. Marcus Aurelius returned to this territory again and again in the Meditations, not as abstract philosophy, but as personal confrontation. He was one of the most powerful men in the world, and he spent decades reminding himself that his worth was not located in his position, his achievements, or the opinions of the people around him. That the self, the genuine self underneath all the performance and the accumulated identity, was something that existed prior to all of that. Something that didn't require external confirmation to be real. That idea isn't comfort, it's a demand. It demands that you locate your sense of adequacy somewhere other than the places you've been looking for it. Somewhere internal. Somewhere that borrowed shame cannot reach, because it was never part of the story that shame was telling. You cannot accept that you might be enough, not because you lack evidence, you have evidence, you've always had evidence. You cannot accept it, because accepting it would require releasing a story that has been organizing your entire inner life for longer than you can remember. And releasing a story that old, that familiar, that deeply embedded, even when it's a story that's been hurting you, feels less like liberation and more like loss. That feeling is normal, and it's the beginning of the real work, returning what was never yours, 7 signs. And if you recognized yourself in more than one of them, if reading through that list produced not just intellectual recognition, but something physical, something that landed in the chest or the throat, then there's something important to acknowledge before we close. Recognition is not the same as resolution. Seeing the pattern doesn't automatically dissolve it. That's not how this works, and pretending otherwise would be doing you a disservice. But recognition is the necessary first step, because you cannot return something you haven't first identified as borrowed. You cannot set down a weight you're still convinced belongs to you. The Stoic practice that's most relevant here isn't a dramatic exercise, it's a daily, unglamorous act of distinction. Epictetus called it diaresis, the practice of separating what is yours from what is not, what is within your control from what is not, what is genuinely part of your nature from what was placed there by circumstances, by other people, by a world that was already in motion before you arrived. Applied to borrowed shame, that practice looks like this. When the inner critic activates, when you feel the reflex to apologize for your presence, to dismiss the compliment, to chase the achievement that will finally be enough, you pause. Not to fight the feeling, not to argue with it, but to ask one question with genuine curiosity: is this mine? Did this originate in something I actually did or chose? Or is this something I inherited from a person, from an environment, from a moment in time that no longer exists? If the answer is that it's borrowed, and for many of the patterns we've discussed today it will be, then you have a choice that most people never realize they have. You can acknowledge the feeling without endorsing it. You can let it move through you without letting it govern you. You can slowly and imperfectly and over a long period of time begin to return what was never yours to carry. That returning doesn't happen in a single moment of clarity. It happens in the accumulation of small refusals. The refusal to apologize for being present. The refusal to intercept the compliment before it lands. The refusal to let an inherited voice deliver verdicts on a life it doesn't understand. You were handed a story about yourself before you were old enough to question it. That's not your fault. But continuing to live inside that story, now that you can see it for what it is, that's a choice. And choices, unlike the past, are entirely within your reach, Start there with one refusal, in one moment, today. If you made it to the end of this video and recognized something in what we covered today, I want you to know that what you felt wasn't just intellectual understanding. That recognition has weight. It means something real is being seen, possibly for the first time. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications if this kind of conversation is something you want to keep having. And leave a comment, not as a gesture, but because I read every single one. And more often than not, the next video starts there. In something someone said in the comments that nobody else had quite found the words for yet, because that's what this channel is, at its core. A space where the things that are hardest to say out loud get said anyway, where the internal conflicts that most people carry in silence get examined with honesty and without judgment. You're not the only one navigating this, not even close. Thank you for being here. See you in the next one.